All right, so our first session today is we're just doing the 1,000-foot view, macro view of HOPWA, right? Because tomorrow we're going to go into more specific activities and deal with some of the issues that you all would wrestle with, some things that we call hotspots. But we know that there's a new agency. We know there might be new staff. So this first session today is just that really, really big picture. So this is also where we encourage questions, or if you have specific scenarios you want us to work into slides for tomorrow, we would gladly do that. But at least so we're all starting at the same point, make sure we understand the same ideas before we go forward.
So basic regulatory eligibility criteria for HOPWA. Everybody knows what HOPWA stands for. Okay. Duplication of benefits or duplication of assistance. We're going to go over some things to be mindful of. Right? And just to provide an overview, just very like you said, of HOPWA funded activities.
So the one reason that I love the HOPWA program is you'll see 2 bullet points and only 2 bullet points when it comes to HOPWA eligibility. So besides one specific HOPWA funded activity, housing information services, to be eligible for HOPWA assistance, you need to have at least one family member diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. This could be a minor, and the total gross annual income of all family members cannot exceed 80% of the area median income. AMI. So we'll break some of those ideas down here in just a few slides to go over that, right? But just keep in mind, this is it. So particularly within your agency, you probably have multiple funding sources, right? And so different funding sources have different eligibility criteria that you're going to screen for. But when it comes to HOPWA, that's all you're worrying about. Anything else that you might think in your head, and we'll go over some examples, are not regulatory. So this is one reason I've always loved this program, is because programs can really design what they need for serving persons on the ground. Because as long as you can prove those 2 things, you're pretty golden. So let's talk about the definition of family, right? So because this comes straight from federal regulations as well, and this also tends to be a sticking point for a lot of programs as they think about the different funding sources in their portfolio. So the definition of family for HOPWA is, and has always been, anyone who is determined to be important to each other's care and well-being. That's it. Right? So pretty big, pretty broad, pretty open. That means to be considered a family, there's no requirement to be, prove, or document that people are married, have the legal right to marry, want to be married, like their spouse, be partnered, like their partner, right? None of that. There's not even a requirement that people have to prove or document that they're related to one another, right? Because we'll hear questions about, you know, I have some adopted children or I have stepchildren. How do we document that for the client file? We'd say, why? Right? The moment they say that minor is their child, you now know it's determined to be important to their care and well-being. So, right, so it's really thinking through that, because on the ground, we would have clients all the time that would say, you know, I'm applying for assistance. I've been living with the same person for 25 years. We used to be in a relationship, but now we aren't. And we'd say, it sounds like you're still important to each other's care and well-being, because why are you living with that person, right? Right, so we'd see examples all the time of that. Are people just being friends? People living with their friend of 10, 20, years. So that's important to through as we go through some of these activities to make sure you are inadvertently leaving people out when you're talking about family.
So family is very broad, but when people are identifying a family, this matters because this will trigger whose income you include when you determine income eligibility. Because remember, when you're determining income eligibility, which we're going to get more in depth tomorrow when I talk about tenant-based rental assistance, it's the income of all family members, right? Family is very broad.
So really, in most cases, anyone who lives under a roof is probably going to be a family. And the next slide, we're going to break down some examples of what probably isn't a family, and particularly some regulatory definitions of things that aren't family members. But generally, if you think about it, if you're living under the roof with someone, they're probably important to your care and well-being. Because otherwise, would you want to share space with the individual? So let's break down this definition of family a little bit, and then talk about some additional relationships that might matter and how those may not be family members and how this will affect eligibility. So we're talking about here about the family. We have the definition again. Heather mentioned they're a family. That means their income is included to determine eligibility and portions of rent when doing a HOPWA rent calculation. That is required. So if someone is a family member and says, I refuse to provide documentation for a family member, that means you can't prove HOPWA eligibility. Because that will be an important thing that we'll talk about tomorrow when it comes to specific HOPWA activities, right? Because different funding programs will say, I just need Heather's income, I don't care about anyone else's. HOPWA, if it's a family, you need everyone's for all HOPWA assistance. But more importantly too, since everyone living together is determined to be important to each other's care and well-being, there's survivors benefits, right? So HOPWA says, if they're important to each other's care and well-being, and God forbid something happened to that person with HIV and they pass away, you should continue to assist that family because they're all living together. They're important to each other's care and well-being. So HOPWA in their regulations has this idea about survivors benefit, where you can continue to assist the household for up to a year after the person passes away. Because HOPWA doesn't want you to say, I'm so sorry about probably the biggest loss of your life for that family member, but now you have to look for additional housing as well. We're so sorry. We're terminating services. Have a good life.
So this would be for family members that are living with the HOPWA individual at the time of their death. So for instance, if they were receiving tenant-based rental assistance, that tenant-based rental assistance, you can establish a grace period. The grantee really is the entity that establishes the grace period for the survivor benefits, but that grace period cannot exceed more than 1 year. So you could continue to assist that family under a survivor benefit. If there was someone else in the family that had an HIV diagnosis, then you could essentially just kind of transfer the assistance over, but there doesn't have to be under that survivor benefit regulatory option.
So we kind of split hairs a little bit and talk about the difference between family and household. So there are 3 types of relationships under household that federal regulations say are not family members. That's a live-in aid. We'll come back to the idea in a second. Foster children and foster adults. So if someone is a live-in aid, a foster child or foster adult, they are not considered a family member. So their income is excluded to determine eligibility and portions of rent. But because they're not a family member, then there's also not survivors benefits. Now they'll all be living together. When we talk about tenant-based rental assistance in STIRMU, you can still provide assistance to the entire household, but you cannot include income of live-in aids, foster children, and foster adults, right? Those federal regulations say you have to exclude that. Then the last one, we always joke, everyone really knows what a roommate is, but somewhere on the ground, this sometimes gets confused, right? So when we talk about roommates, we're talking about a living arrangement solely that exists to split housing costs, right? So there's no determined to be important to each other's care and well-being. There's not a live-in aid, foster child, or foster adult. It is literally someone that you found because you need to split the rent and utilities with. And if they don't pay their share of the rent or they eat your bread, you're going to kick them out and find someone else. That is a roommate, right? So for those of us on the ground, right, sometimes clients will say, oh, I'm living with my roommate. You know, say, what does that mean, right? And so we'll start to walk through some of these to figure it out. That's important though, because a roommate's income is excluded to determine eligibility and portions of rent, because it would be super awkward to have to go to an actual roommate and say, hey, Heather, I'm applying for housing assistance for people with HIV. I'm going to need your pay stubs. She would be like, dude, what are you talking about? Why? Right? Assistance, right? Assistance is prorated, meaning you can't provide assistance to that person. Right. So in TBRA or STIRMU, you're going to have to split it. You can't cover the entire rent, the entire utilities, because there's sort of no relationship there. And it also does not include survivors benefits. Would make sense. It's just to split housing costs. If something happens, they'll find a new roommate.
If they have a roommate and like in their agreement it says this roommate does the electric and then this one I can pay the whole electric. right? Because in there, you know what I mean?
We can want to disturb you, right? About how do you document what the total cost is? Yes, potentially, yes.
Well, yeah, well, possibly, yes. Remind me.
Okay.
We're gonna parking lot that, yeah.
So all of this is together, because particularly we are still talking about the first bullet point for HOPWA eligibility is when you're sitting down with the client, you really want to determine that relationship that everyone has with one another and help explain why that's important, right? Because we'll see clients that don't want to provide income, think that they're quote unquote gaming the system, right? But then you start to walk through the consequences of that and you start to ask questions about, yes, you might be living with someone and you've only been living together for 20 years, right? You're just friends, but what were to happen if you pass away, right? Do you want them to continue to be assisted? And if they say, well, yeah, I don't want to have them to worry, then you're really veering towards there's more. They're important to each other's care and well-being. All right, so think about that through that lens of there's no requirement to document. It's just a client attested saying this person is important to me. You have a family. We'll find lots of typos.
Typos.
So the other thing that we'll go into is the definition of income, because this also comes right from federal regulations, also important because sometimes on the ground we'll see programs unknowingly pick and choose what income they include or exclude, which is problematic when monitoring comes in either from the state or HUD comes in to monitor to say, we see this as part of your income. Why don't we see income related to it? So this comes straight from federal regulations. So the definition of income is all amounts, monetary or not, which go to or on behalf of the family, head of or spouse, even if temporarily absent, or to any other family member.
See the term family here? That's where you differentiate. And when I did this and doing rent calculations and working in other programs, it was always easiest for me to remember where to start and from a baseline of whose income would be included are those who are family members. And those who aren't, I didn't have to worry about that. So you can kind of like lean into the reg itself to say, okay, you're only going to get income of for family members. And that definition is broad. So it helps, I think.
Absolutely, because particularly this is where you're going to have to ask about income types for best friends living together, for children. And so we'll talk about in a second some of the income that's excluded. But one of the biggest issues we see is programs automatically assume that the income of anyone under the age of 18 is excluded. And that is not correct. There are some income types that will be excluded, but just that blanket statement is incorrect because they might have income types that are going to affect HOPWA eligibility and portions of rent.
So ask about income for every family member within the household. Ask about it and then figure out what it is, figure out the age of the person, and then we'll help you figure out what you include or exclude.
Income also includes any anticipated sources from outside the family during the 12-month period following admission, right? So anything they anticipate to be coming in. So this is also important because regularly occurring gifts, particularly regularly occurring cash gifts, are income. So we always say, particularly in 2022, it's pretty difficult to be zero income, actually zero income, because the safety net is not there to cover all of people's resources. And there are certainly some people that are, so I don't want to say there aren't. But when you dig in and start asking questions, someone will say, I don't have any income. And so your intake might say, how do you pay for your car bill? How do you pay for insurance and all those things? And they'll say, oh, my mom sends me $500 a month. They say, oh, your mom sends you $500 each and every month? Yes. That should be your flag that person has income. So
Unfortunately, that's just how the regulations.
How do you get proof of something?
Doesn't mean we always agree that things should, be income. It just, it is.
How do you get proof of something like that? Because what if mom don't know?
Say that again.
Because what if mom don't know he's getting assistance? How would you get proof of that?
Well, if mom or aunt was giving the client that money every month, mom write something down.
And what if mom don't know the status or whatever?
Oh, Well, she doesn't know his status. She's just giving the person income anyway, right? So mom could write something down, or if it's really, very severe situation, then the client do a self-certification of income and then provide some additional backup documentation. But what I would do is have a form and have she or they put it in writing with the date, say you get $500 a month, and they could, maybe you could add something else to that. But you have to do that. You could do a self-certification and just put some case notes that one is status, very sensitive situation. We've tried other ways to collect this documentation. It's not there, and then you have due diligence.
Absolutely, because I was going to say that due diligence, and so if you're coming down to a client's self-certification of that, that's absolutely fine. But at least you can show that you tried. What you don't want to do is ignore it and say this is a sensitive subject, so we will just avoid it. And then monitoring comes and says, oh, your intake is $500 cash gift. Where is that in the file, and how does it affect portions of rent?
You can do self-certification.
So in a moment, we'll talk about bullet point 3, because I can already see some people's brains turning. Once again, not all income is includable for federal regulations. So this is sometimes where it's good to fall back to say, like, federal regulations say yes to this, but no to something else. We're talking about a HUD program, right? So other different federal programs might have different definitions of income. It may not exclude anything. And the last one we'll just briefly talk about, because this is also the point where people then get up and walk out, is annual income also means amount derived from assets from which any family member has access. So the 1,000-foot overview of that is if a client has a checking or savings account, or any family members do, it's possible they might have income from that. And so that just means you're going to use the actual value of a checking or savings account. It means you're going to have to potentially do some extra steps to figure out. So in a lot of situations, assets don't really affect portions of rent or eligibility, or it might affect it like $1 or $2. But the issue we see is programs not asking about assets. Particularly, they assume low-income persons don't have assets. It's 2022. Almost everything is in some form of direct deposit. Right, so people's work is usually direct deposited. So security checks are direct deposited, TANF checks are direct deposited. So people probably have an asset. So you need to be asking questions and going through some additional steps to determine eligibility. But so no one freaks out. Once again, you're not using the total value. So if you're thinking like, oh, Heather gave me verification that she has $1,000 in her checking account, what did I do wrong? It's possible nothing, right? Because most checking accounts have zero. Right, have zero interest. So
there's no interest, right? So there's no asset income, because there's no interest.
So we just like to asterisk that for people, something to think about, but don't freak out about it.
The list of types of income that are included in annual income is in 24 CFR 5.609.
You can go to the, I think it's up on the next slide.
Oh.
So we don't list all the income sources that are includable or excludable, because particularly on the ground, it's just good to know where to find them. So particularly when I was working with clients, I would actually print out what's Exhibit 5.1, which cites the federal regulations, because the more you work on the ground, you really start to figure out the common income types that you see for your area, and you know what should be included or excluded. But once in a blue moon, a client would ask a question or bring up an income type that you had no idea about. Right? Because you just have no idea about additional combat pay for service members who served during the Iraq War. And so you'd say, oh, let me look up and see if that's in federal regulations.
What's included in annual income, that list is shorter than the exclusions. The exclusions is really long. And some of them is really obscure.
Congress wrote it, so it's in regulations. So the one thing to note, if you go to 5.609B, that's the inclusions. It's going to list 9, only 8 apply to HOPWA. So the 9th one in that list is student financial aid. That is never included in the HOPWA program.
That's only for housing shares voucher programs.
So it doesn't matter if we're talking about loans, grants, None of that is included for the HOPWA program. So I just want to note that. So if you read through that and say, oh, we haven't been asking about student financial aid, don't have to worry. And we'll also note that C isn't a totally exhaustive list because there's new income types that will pop up. Think during COVID, right? There was the stimulus payments, there was advanced child tax care credits. Those are federally excluded. So while they're not listed there, it said so in the CARES Act legislation. So we always tell people, if you have questions about an income type, if it's included or excluded, you don't see it on that list, ask the grantee. If the grantee's not sure, they'll ask for assistance just to make sure, right? Because there will always be something that will pop up. You'll say, I have no idea the answer to that. And it's okay to not know the answer. That's HOPWA eligibility. So if we didn't review it, it is not a regulatory requirement. So that means under the federal program, there is no requirement for someone applying for a HOPWA assistance to be a citizen, prove citizenship, none of that.
Sorry, we lost internet for a second, so it stopped sharing the screen. Okay, you're sorry.
And so that applies not just to the person with HIV, but their entire family. There's no requirement for people to apply for HOPWA assistance to have an ID, a birth certificate, even want to present that, not a federal requirement under the HOPWA program. There's no requirement to check or screen people out based upon criminal history, right? And this is where we'll always say different HUD programs have different requirements. So we'll always hear programs say, what about sex offenders? What about people with methamphetamine charges? What about, you fill in the blank? And we'll say, you are now conflating HCV regulations. Yes, thank you. With HOPWA. HOPWA does not have that requirement. Now, that doesn't mean if you offer assistance, a landlord's going to accept them. That's a whole different ballgame.
We're talking your program, or we're talking HOPWA regulations, right? What a landlord does is local state law. That's different. Yep.
They are not for the federal program.
We do get that a lot. Well, HUD requires blah, 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 blah. Like, no, there's no blanket HUD rule that applies to every program. You have to check criminal history, you have to do this. Eligibility requirements are specific to the funding source across. Yep, HOPWA regulations do not have anything in red about any of these as part of eligibility requirements.
So in like for example, we would still would have the birth certificate, Social Security number, everybody on TV, because they have to sign up for it. Correct.
Not for local regulations, but
Right.
that can be sort of individual programs. Grantees have discretion to design their program. Somebody could come on the program without that. And as part of working with them in case management, you worked hard getting their security card and their ID so they can apply for programs that require them. But that's not a requirement for entry into the HOPWA TBRA program.
Like, for example, in one case, I have a person who can't get a birth certificate or ID. So I just had to apply for it, and of course she got denied. She doesn't have a birth certificate or ID, so I just put that. That's fine.
But if you start to think through this just practically on the ground, we would screen people. We don't, right? You're going to hear us talk a lot about screening people in, not out. We'd screen people into our HOPWA program. We know there are landlords that didn't ask about any of this. So that means we can prove HOPWA eligibility, get them in a unit, make sure that unit passed all the requirements. Why would we have additional requirements? Particularly if you want to be a low barrier program and you want to serve people with HIV, but other programs can't. Particularly if you're worried about lowering the community viral load, stopping the spread of HIV. The goal is to get and keep people housed.
And for those you enroll into, say, like HOPWA TBRA, for example, that don't have a criminal history, that do have an ID birth certificate, you could have some folks that can apply for other HUD programs and move on.
Mhm.
But some may not be able to move on for all different kinds of reasons. That's fine. Yeah.
So there's no federal requirement for people to have income. I think this is less common now, but we used to see a lot of programs talk about we're doing a rental calculation, so they need to have income to pay a portion of rent. And we would say, well, just remember your middle school algebra, right? 30% zero is zero. So you're still going to do a rent calc, even if there's zero income. You can't ignore that.
But
But there-
really, it's worded oddly, right? Like they all are. Must pay a portion of rent, which is the higher up. But don't confuse must pay with must have income. If they have income, then this is for that. But if they don't, then like Steve said.
And then finally, there's no requirement under the federal program for individuals to participate in case management. So when we go through activities, we always like to differentiate. That doesn't mean they don't have to work with staff. They need to prove eligibility for TBRA.
For example.
Right, but you're going to have individuals that don't need or don't want case management. You're going to have people that need it but refuse it. If you think about, particularly if you're just offering housing and that individual can sustain without it, why go through the hassle of forcing someone through something that they don't want, which will most likely backfire?
But that's different. Like Steve said, for folks that are receiving TBRA, they do need to participate in annual recertifications, inspection. That's not case management. We're case managers. We all know management. That's totally different.
What is TBRA?
Tenant TBRA, tenant-based rental assistance.
Thank you.
Sure.
So think through anything else in your mind that you thought, is this a requirement? It's just those first two bullet points. Everything else is not a federal requirement. Which brings me back to my original statement, why I love the HOPWA program. On the ground in Maine, we really got to design a program that served the individuals in our different communities. So Portland was a refugee asylee resettlement area. Rural Maine was not. And so we really got to design a program saying, what do we need to do to serve people and their family members with HIV?
Is any of this surprising? Yeah. There are programs across the United States that do screen for citizenship, do require ID, do screen out. But HUD's Office of HIV Housing, right? That's the headquarter HUD office that administers HOPWA funding. Their guidance is to screen in for assistance, not out of assistance.
All right, pivot away from HOPWA eligibility. We're going to talk a few moments about the duplication of benefits or assistance. So before we start talking about different HOPWA funded activities, we just want to circle back to this idea to make sure you aren't double dipping and inadvertently violating other federal requirements. I like to say things I know will trigger Heather, particularly when we're in public, because she really can't just start ranting and raving. So what is duplication of benefits? So duplication of benefits occurs when federal financial assistance is provided to a person or an entity, such as a nonprofit organization, through a program, and that person or entity has received financial assistance for that exact same cost or expense from that other source. So duplication of benefits or assistance can exist both at the client level and at your agency level, right? So we want to suss those out as we go through. Duplication of benefits is problematic when another funding source does not explicitly allow this. We say that because we're going to talk about some examples that people think are duplication of benefits, and it's not. Because you can look at that other federal programs regulations and say, oh, we can do that. It's okay, because they said this does not count. Otherwise, federal regulations, usually through 2 CFR 200, do not explicitly prohibit duplication of benefits. So if you can't see something in a program that says you can pay it, always ask first, right? Because I mentioned 2 CFR 200 because we want to talk about at least this idea that there are multiple federal regulations that apply to different programs. And so if you're not the finance person, I don't want to talk about 2 CFR 200 because it'll also be the point that everyone gets up and leaves, right? But someone will say, but Steve, HOPWA regulations don't talk about this. And we say, oh, let's go to this other big long list of regs.
2 CFR 200 just basically, in short, a bunch of regulations about cost allowability.
For
When
all federal awards.
Allocable, reasonable, eligible costs, ineligible costs, so on and so forth. And most programs, I think all, have to follow that just as a general rule around
Absolutely.
costs.
Applies to
That
you.
could be a whole month-long training. Oh, she's there.
Not the training I want to do.
But,
That's not the training I.
no.
So let's go from that big picture back to HOPWA, right? So we're going right back to your guys' wheelhouse. So examples of duplication of benefits in the HOPWA program. So things that are not allowable. So using HOPWA STRMU funds, short-term rent, mortgage, or utility assistance to assist households with expenses that were incurred during a period when HOPWA rental assistance, such as TBRA, or another federally, state, or local rental assistance subsidy is already in use. So if a household has a subsidy, you cannot use STRMU to pay their portion of rent. Right? So no matter what the reason that they can't, and it could be a perfectly valid reason, you cannot use STRMU assistance to pay that.
You couldn't use STRMU, so if they had tenant-based rental assistance and they were responsible for utilities supplied to the unit, and they had a utility allowance, right, when you calculate portions of rent, they were behind on their utilities, you can't use STRMU to help them with their utilities.
See, that's where on my side, it gets difficult, because if they don't have an income, when I put them in TBRA, like I pretty much have to require, not require,
Yeah.
but just, I'm using that word.
Yeah.
To require them to have an income to be in TBRA, because I know I can help you with your utilities. I can't house you in a place that I know you can't keep your utilities.
We're gonna talk about it
Right.
tomorrow. We talk about tenant-based rental assistance.
So that's a possibility. Life will change.
Yeah. Because in situations where somebody has tenant-based rental assistance and they have zero income, if they're responsible for utilities for the unit and they have a utility allowance, they're gonna be getting utility reimbursement payment in the rent calculation. So, HOPWA TBRA would pay the full portion of rental in order, and you have this utility reimbursement payment amount that you would pay directly to the client or utility. So we'll talk about utility reimbursement tomorrow. It's one of my slides. So now I'll beat it up and I'll give you some examples. Okay. There's also a new HOPWA income and rent calculation curriculum on the HUD website. If people haven't taken it, I would definitely take it. Just plug away on it. It's self-paced. It's pretty straightforward. Easy to go through. And it talks about utility reimbursement. I think I put that in.
Mhm.
Sure. Yeah. Yep.
Another common duplication of benefits in HOPWA is using permanent housing placement, PHP funds, which are moving costs. We'll talk about more of those tomorrow, to pay the tenant or the program's portion of the first or last month's rent. Right, so if someone has tenant-based rental assistance and they need to pay first month's rent, if you really think that through, TBRA will pay HOPWA's share of first month's rent and the client's responsible for their share of first month's rent. Same for last month's rent. So during PHP, we'll talk about security deposits. And so if a landlord requires first, last, and security, we'll just talk about how you call that all a security deposit for what you could pay for, right? But otherwise, it's a duplication of benefits. Or at the agency level, we'll sometimes be using HOPWA funds and another source to cover the exact same cost, like staff, right? Say that your agency doesn't have really good timesheets or timekeeping, and so someone goes in to monitor and realize Heather charged 40 hours to HOPWA for 1 week and 20 hours to Ryan White. Her timesheet shows 40 hours. You double.
But it's not really just about charging. It's getting reimbursed
Right.
twice for the same cost. Because the charging, you charge and fix it. But it's like, yeah, me charging the TBRA and another program and get our agency getting reimbursed twice. That's not good.
So we bring that up because that's that sort of administrative stuff that why does my agency make me do X? Why does the state make me fill out all these things? Because they're trying to avoid that third bullet point, right? To make sure that people aren't being reimbursed for the same cost from different awards.
So if you get Section 8, you can't get it.
You can move in.
You can get some HOPWA, you can't get tenant-based rental assistance or STIRMU.
Right.
So I don't
Yeah.
know, I understand.
Somebody could have a Section 8 voucher who's a HOPWA eligible individual and get HOPWA funded case management. That's case management rental assistance. Those are not the state costs at all, right? So you can get case management.
Right.
Or another supportive service, transportation, mental health, meals, nutrition. But somebody cannot get housing choice voucher, tenant-based rental assistance.
But so,
Housing choice voucher, STIRMU,
this is probably another.
SCRU.
That's all right. We love it.
But some permanent housing, if I use my permanent housing, I start my TBRA and after that, that's fine, right? Because they want more TBRA during.
So that gets to that point of the exact same cost for the exact same period of time.
Right, so
Right.
as long as it's at the same time.
Right. Right, so say you use STIRMU assistance to help someone while you get their TBRA up and running. Once TBRA kicks in, you have to stop STIRMU, but otherwise you're not billing the exact same cost for the exact same time.
So like how you were saying that you can pay moving someone in.
Mhm.
How does that work? Like, do you pay the prorated rent?
I
Like,
get
like,
2
months or
months of
something?
prorated rent and then I pay deposit on until.
That's it. With the next few slides, we're going to break down the activities and the big picture eligible costs. So why don't we go ahead and jump into, I think there's one more duplication of benefits. So how to avoid it? Have very strong forms and applications that inquire about any forms of assistance. And you're going to hear us talk about this more tomorrow, but keep asking that questions in different ways. Don't assume your clients are going to know exactly what you mean when you say rental assistance, right? So when we talk about STIRMU, we're going to say, what's your unit rent? What do you pay in rent? In theory, those numbers should be the same unless they have a roommate, but that's when you're going to start to see those weird things like, oh, your portion of, you paid $211 for rent, and that's going to be your red flag. So you build those questions in to get to it, and then you're also proving that you're asking about it. You're doing your due diligence.
Your monthly rent's 1,000, but you only pay 200. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
There's a subsidy or something going on there. Yeah.
That was a big thing when Mount Air rental system.
Yeah.
People kept trying to get Mount
Yeah.
Air.
So it's one question and then another question. So it's like getting at.
Right. So know where to find information about what is and isn't duplication of benefits. So that could be reaching out to the state. As we always like to point out, particularly for your utility question, people can have rental assistance and still apply for LIHEAP, low income housing, heating and energy assistance program. So when we would have clients that were very low to zero income, they had to pay for utilities and the utility reimbursement wouldn't always cover it, we'd immediately start referring them to programs that we knew weren't duplication of benefits.
So LIHEAP is not a duplication. You still give somebody utility allowance, they can still get a utility reimbursement, and they can apply to LIHEAP to get assistance through LIHEAP.
And then finally, have that strong financial documentation to prove that your agency isn't charging and being reimbursed for the same cost twice. Yeah. Before we jump into the HOPWA funded activities, we're just going to take a quick 2-minute breather, get some water. 5 minutes, right?
Thank you.
I'll accept it.
It's,
Yeah.
So since I started, this is my first real long training in years at March.
Hey, COVID.
Yeah, so I'm like, this is great.
And that's what we're starting with that thing.
So yeah, I'll tell other people how, I literally do 5 days. 5 days. That's what I'm
So I'm going to, oh.
Really?
So they sat there.
And then like, for me, I will send it right to. Alright, so like, you know, people say, either saying, oh, you don't know, I'll tell them.
Yeah, all the time, they don't.
I know. All of them. So, but in that, 12 was at my house. So. So what started? We've been Actually played Corey. I didn't bring my eggs. I don't know. Gotta get everything out. We got 20 years. Yeah.
All are done. That place is crazy.
Well, I think I.
Very cool.
Right, yeah, right. Yeah. But anyway. Already did.
No, but I-
Oh.
How to charge.
I was like, search or at least someone making sense.
It's all about first. I think we're ready. We're getting there. Oh, yeah.
At least when I can get that. Oh, I don't know the, yeah. Or at least I don't know where to refer you to someone else.
Right. He's, not afraid.
He said to let him know. I like holding something, but I don't want to hold something. I like this kind or up here. And these are.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think we're ready to go. Thank you. All right, everyone. Let's jump in and start talking about some of these HOPWA funded activities. So we're going to go over almost all of the HOPWA funded activities besides capital development, because that's a whole nother 3-day training in itself. So the asterisk or warning here is just because you see the slides that say this is allowable doesn't mean you can immediately email your agency and start spending the dollars, right? Because the state has to put what they're going to do in a consolidated plan, an annual action plan that goes out through contracts. So if you see something and you're not sure if you can or should do it, make sure to talk to Henry. But at least you'll understand the full universe of HOPWA. So if you go online for HOPWA guidance, if you attend a HOPWA online webinar or training, you'll at least have an idea of what this activity is, even if you aren't funded for it. So the first one we're going to talk about, or the first two we're going to talk about is HOPWA permanent housing. So to preface, when we talk about permanent housing, that means it's in fact permanent, meaning that there's no time limits on assistance for tenant-based rental assistance, TBRA, or permanent facility-based housing. And so the best way to think through that is tenant-based rental assistance means it stays with the household or family, right, with the tenant. Permanent facility-based housing means the unit's subsidized, right? So if you don't do permanent facility-based housing, don't worry, but that just means it always stays there. But once again, both of those are permanent. There are no time limits, for example, on tenant-based rental assistance. Some HUD programs do have time limits, right? So particularly before COVID, programs like ESG, the Emergency Solutions Grant, in their regulations has a time limit. HOPWA does not. So therefore, as long as people are eligible, in theory, they can continue to receive assistance. So what you'll see, I should have prefaced this too, on all of these slides, we just go over what this is, some examples of eligible costs, because those are the things and only the things that can be charged there, and then some quick notes. So if you're funded for tenant-based rental assistance or permanent facility-based housing, for TBRA, your eligible costs are your housing assistance payment or HAP, or the HOPWA share of the rent, whatever it is that you might call it, as well as that utility reimbursement payment, as Heather's been referencing. So we'll say when applicable, right? Because you do that rent count. So those two things get charged to TBRA. We point out the utility reimbursement payment under TBRA, because once in a blue moon, we'll see programs try to charge that to STRMU. Because STRMU is the only one of the only activities that talks about utilities. And so they do this weird financial workaround. But if it's a result of doing a TBRA rent calc, it's going to be charged to TBRA. For facility-based housing, any of your leasing or operating expenses, And then what you're going to see over and over and over, and us stressing this, is the staff salary fringe and other overhead costs for a HOPWA activity should be charged to that activity. So staff that are doing TBRA, right, determining eligibility for TBRA, doing rent calculations, doing inspections, their time should be charged to TBRA. It doesn't matter their job title, right? So what we'll sometimes see is people say like our case manager does inspections, so they charge all their time to support services. That is incorrect, right? They're doing a function of TBRA, so the staff salary fringe and overhead, paper, pens, you know, all of those things that you need to actually deliver TBRA assistance gets charged to TBRA. There's that note to keep stressing that. In 2022, the number of questions we still get say, yeah, we get it's permanent, but at 25 months, we kick them off. But nope, permanent means permanent. Permanent, permanent, permanent.
You use tenant-based rental assistance transitionally, but only when somebody's securing another form of permanent housing, like a housing choice voucher, or they're moving into a public housing unit, or some other kind of state or local rental assistance. But otherwise, TBRA is permanent. HUD's Office of HIV Housing is very, very clear that TBRA is permanent. People should not be discharged to unstable housing or homelessness, and there should not be hard stops. So unless you're moving somebody on, right, to another program, and they're following all the rules, following all the regulations, TBRA is like a housing choice vouchers.
Which is key when you think about HOPWA eligibility requirements. So if you don't have to prove citizenship, there's no documentation of birth certificates, it is possible you can assist anyone who may never be eligible for another program. And that's okay, because your goal is to get them stably housed, to hopefully get their viral load under control, to reduce the community spread, right? So that's the idea. You can really design a program based upon who do you need to serve. So HOPWA transitional or short-term. So the activities under this umbrella are transitional facility-based housing, housing that stays in the unit, and then short-term. So transitional facility-based housing is technically for 24 months of assistance. There's an asterisk there because even for transitional facility-based housing in HOPWA, it's also not a hard stop. Right, you should try to get someone out of transitional facility-based housing within 24 months, but it doesn't mean at the end of the 24 months, you're kicking them out. That's not HOPWA's goal or purpose. Short-term facility-based housing is technically only 60 days of assistance in a 6-month period. We'll come back to that in just a second. Eligible cost, since it's facility-based, it's either going to be something leasing or operating, including for short-term hotel motel assistance. If you're a regulatory nerd like Heather and I and dig through HOPWA regs, it never mentions hotel or motel. So sometimes programs are confused where if they can do that or want to do that where it get charged. So hotel motel assistance is a form of short-term facility-based housing.
But that can only be funded with leasing money. So HOPWA leasing.
And then once again, the staff salary fringe and overhead costs for delivering this type of HOPWA assistance should be charged to this type of HOPWA assistance. Now, as we've been talked about, HOPWA is 30 years old. So a lot of the regulations were designed quickly in the middle of an epidemic and without a lot of detail. So short-term facility-based housing for HOPWA, when it was written, was really talking about like things like emergency shelter, like an actual emergency shelter. So things like hotel motel assistance aren't written in there because it was sort of quick to get it out onto the ground. So sometimes programs will also start to confuse some of the regulations that were written in there and how to apply it. So the most common is the 60-day cap for hotel, 60-day cap for short-term does not apply to hotel motel assistance. You should try, right, because it's a general principle. Most programs don't have enough money to keep a family in a house in a hotel for a long period of time anyway.
Right, so if you're gonna want to be mindful for how long you're paying for it, because it will get pricey really fast.
But at least if there is a situation, once again, day 61, you're not kicking them out and say, it's been nice for 60 days, now figure out your own housing. It is not a regulatory cap.
What is the leasing funding, meaning monthly leasing, is that what we're talking about, or are we talking about just?
It's an activity, it's one of the eligible activities in HOPWA regulations. So when it's leasing is really related to types of facility-based housing. So a project sponsor could go to a private landlord and lease a whole building or different units for facility-based housing, for permanent transition. Yes. Yeah.
The opposite of that would be if that project sponsor owns a building, there's no lease.
There's no lease today.
So they wouldn't be using leasing, right? Then they'd only be operating because now they need money to operate a building that they own.
A common example of several grantees do master leasing, which is really just leasing, but they'll do master leasing, where again the project sponsors work with local landlords and come up with like an MOU agreement, and they'll lease like blocks of units or blocks of apartments, but you use leasing because there's actually a lease, right? Because they don't own it. Yep. Okay. And then the project sponsor effectively becomes kind of like the project sponsor is the tenant of that landlord owner, and then you sublease to HOPWA eligible individuals or families. Yep. Yep.
So I don't think you guys are funded for that, but just to put that up there, so that if you see that anywhere, you see information about, that's what we're talking about.
If we know a program that wanted to do that, they apply just to do that.
That would be a Henry question for
That
later.
would be a Henry question.
I said it's all that how that builds up the food chain for contracts and annual action plans and con plans becomes more complicated.
Say that question again.
Cassie.
I have a organization that wants to do this, and they won't let me, so if they would apply to just do this part.
So you have an additional organization that would like to operate HOPWA, but
just
it's within your coverage area, not like just a little group of counties.
No, it would just be for the question.
We'd have to check because it would kind of be like sub granting, and we don't sub grant, but we can put out like an RFP for that specific activity and see who applies.
That would help.
That's right.
Often firms will do master leasing when they know clients that they're serving have difficulty getting a lease at their own name, right? And they're working on trying to get tenant histories and then having a lease for a period of time. And then sometimes what they'll do is even transition in that year and take over the lease themselves. That's an option.
Back to the activities that you all are funded for. So it says homeless prevention, right? But don't confuse that with like what the ESG program would call homeless prevention. So what we're really talking about is STRMU, short-term rent, mortgage, and utility assistance, with the idea of you're using this to prevent homelessness. So eligible costs, current or past or current due rent, mortgage, and necessary utilities. And then for the third time, staff salary, fringe, and overhead costs for delivering STRMU. So we like to highlight past or current due rent because STRMU isn't like short-term rental assistance. In theory, a household shouldn't come into your agency and say, we're going to provide you 21 weeks of rental assistance no matter what. That's not the purpose of STRMU. Right, so that's why and there are a lot of situations we would absolutely do that. But we'll talk about some of that ongoing need and how to document that. But that's why it's always current due. Because we'll also say HOPWA doesn't allow future payments, because we'll sometimes see programs say like, oh, there's just not enough staff. Can we just go ahead and cut a check for 4 months of rent? We know the client's going to need it. So it's going to pay December, January, February, and March. So what you get. So household must demonstrate need for assistance. We'll talk about that tomorrow, but it's an extra eligibility piece for HOPWA, right? That they have to not only show that they can't pay that, but there's an eligible need for why they can't pay it. We talked about it's not supposed to be used for repeated ongoing assistance. The need must be verified per request. We'll break that down more tomorrow. But there is additional caps on assistance that are in HOPWA regulations, that 21 weeks of assistance in a 52-week period. So that's right from HOPWA regulations, right? So that's another reason why STRMU really is short-term, to sort of bridge that gap.
There is a STRMU resource guidebook too.
In their binder.
online. Is it in the?
Yeah, I think so.
Did
Yeah.
you put it in there?
Put it in there just to put the rental assistance one.
Yeah, yeah. That one needs to be, hopefully, well, there are good parts. But look at your thoughts, and I'm like, this is good, this is good. No, no, no.
So HOPWA moving,
HP.
so HOPWA moving financial assistance, right? So outside of all of those activities, those can't pay for what clients might need to actually move into a unit. But if a client needs some of the things we're going to talk about in a moment, that can't be funded under those activities. So if the client needs move-in assistance for a unit, we're going to talk about permanent housing placement or PHP. Eligible costs, the next few slides go over some common examples. Staff salary, fringe, yada, yada, yada. So some notes on PHP. PHP can only be used to establish new tenancy or residency where continued occupancy is expected. The idea of when you see these don't make sense. You shouldn't pay a security deposit if the client says, oh, I'm going to move in and never going to pay any rent, so I'll probably be evicted for a year. Well, that may not be the best use of these dollars. And then you somehow need to prove this idea of continued occupancy. So that's usually a lease, but that or a big part of the lease, but that's not required. So some programs have their own forms, it can be self-verification. As long as you're doing your due diligence to show that you're proving that this is an expectation.
So someone does not have to be homeless to access PHP. They could be currently housed, they're accessing new housing, right? Whereas STRMU, just as a reminder, remember it's to prevent homelessness. So someone must be already housed to access STRMU. People who are residing in emergency shelter, there's no rent, mortgage, utility amount to pay. So they wouldn't be eligible for STRMU. Back to PHP.
So the PHP list isn't totally exhaustive. These are just the most common. Once again, if you have specific examples, check with Henry before you start spending it. Some common things are application fees charged by landlords or property management companies, credit checking expenses, right? Sometimes that's separate. One-time utility connection fees. I think you had mentioned using that for that, right? Because particularly those can be super expensive, so the clients need that assistance. Security deposits that are required to move in. And so that HOPWA guidance caps that no more than 2 months total rent. Right, so we like to highlight that too, because different HUD programs have different requirements, particularly with COVID money. You can take more than 2 months rent, ESG people, right? But HOPWA is capped at 2 months, and we're also rent once again it's the total rent. Right, so if you're going to use security deposits to someone with TVRA, they might pay $100 a month. But if their total rent is $1,000, you can do a security deposit for $2,000. It's 2 months of total rent. First or last month's rent for households not receiving rental assistance from HOPWA or any other financial assistance program. Some sort of newer guidance, rent for utility arrears on a previous unit. If you can document that those rent or utility arrears are a barrier to establishing new housing. So we're seeing this pop up quite a lot about the rent or utility arrears, particularly now that landlords are finally catching up after eviction moratorium and rental markets are so tight. Landlords are really cracking down and raising the requirements to rent. But this is coming up quite a bit. The PHP would be that one, once it's a previous unit.
The unit that they're not living in. So this would be applicable to a prior unit in which they're not living in. If they're moving, right, yes, you could use PHP to pay for past due rent or utility arrears. For a unit they're not living in. If they were living in the unit, that would be STRMU. Right.
We just clump together other fees, right? So other fees that are necessary for someone to move in. We'll always, this is another one to stress, if you have a particular fee, always ask Henry. There's also sometimes we still see landlords that charge fees that are just illegal, right? And so a lot of them are what's up to a state, right? So we'll get
What
fees.
I get key deposit.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll get questions saying, can we use PHP funds to pay this fee? The answer is potentially, but also make sure it's not illegal.
Interesting.
Right, because some states will say this is an ineligible fee, so if it's illegal, then no, you can't use HOPWA for it. Sometimes people use it for mediation services to help landlord tenant issue during the move-up process, and an initial payment for renter's insurance is eligible under PHP. If renter's insurance is required to move in, what we want to stress is for the initial payment. That initial payment is whatever that initial payment is, right? So if the payment covers 1 month or 6 months, it's the initial payment. There are no HOPWA funds that can cover renter's insurance after that. So that's where you always want to be careful and start to plan that out on how clients can continue.
So the initial payment is only 1 month, you can pay only 1 month, but the initial payment is for 12 months. But what's the initial?
So it's not exhaustive. The only thing that we also like to highlight, the common question comes up, PHP funds cannot be used to actually pay for a moving truck or vehicle. The HOPWA guidance that's very clear about that, that hasn't changed. But you can use PHP funds for staff to help someone figure out how to work that out, to find other funding sources, they can charge their time. HOPWA cannot pay for the actual vehicle. So. To move away from the housing activities, let's talk about some of those wraparound supports. So HOPWA funded support services. So we're going to talk about some examples of support services. The staff salary and fringe seems pretty straightforward for some of the examples, like case management. That's really only a staff thing anyway. But if you think about it, depending on the support services you deliver, you might have overhead costs for delivering food assistance or transportation. Right, so in our agency, we would use support services dollars to buy bus passes, and so the staff time to order those to go pick them up and to do that stuff, we get charged to support services. Because you'll see here in a moment, particularly when we talk about HOPWA admin, by the time you get down through all of that, then you're only using HOPWA admin for admin costs. But that's usually the biggest issue about that. So this is to help provide wraparound supports to assist with obtaining and maintaining stable housing, improving access to care, outcomes, and other social determinants of health. The idea is to help assist families with increasing their self-sufficiency and accessing other mainstream resources or benefits. Self-sufficiency is not a requirement for the HOPWA program, but we always stress the idea of increasing it because there's always something someone can do, even if that's applying for other assistance or benefits. Right, because HOPWA cannot cover everyone's needs. I'm sure your agency does not have the funds to cover everyone's needs. You can help make them more sufficient by sort of diversifying where they're applying things. Right, so that's the idea of self-sufficiency. Maybe someone will become self-sufficient, but once again, not a requirement. If any of you have the pleasure of filling out the HOPWA paper or anything associated, this list is going to look very familiar. These are the most common types of support services. So adult daycare and personal assistance, alcohol and drug abuse services, case management, child care education, employment assistance and training, health and medical services. We're going to talk about particularly some of these things that are medically related. There's some federal restrictions on that. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. So we'll put a pin in that. Legal services, life skills outside of case management. So we always use the example, this is where we're particularly when we talk about support services tomorrow, right? Because someone may not need full case management or want it, but maybe they need help with figuring out some certain activities. Like we use life skills in our agency to help teach people how to read a bus map and get on a bus, right? Because that's not a skill everyone has. And so we say, do you want case management? They can help you. And you say, no. But you need to know how to read a bus map to go to the grocery store. We can help you with that, right? We use it particularly for new asylum seekers and refugees to help them shop at a grocery store. It was brand new to them. So instead of going through a full case management intake, which could be traumatic and re-traumatizing to ask questions, we would just say, let's just do the basics. Our life skills worker will help you with those basic life skills.
We literally hired someone to do life skills. So they might have had some case management, but case managers' caseloads are bigger, right? They don't have, we wanted to have a program where we could, help someone navigate the local laundry, how to, apply for, housing, how to, get around, like you said, get around on the bus. So our life skills worker would go with the person and actually teach them that and coach them around that.
How to get your meds, how to take your meds, how to remind yourself to take your meds, how do you communicate with your doctor if there's problems or issues or side effects to your meds. Right, so without doing a 32-page case management intake, it was a simple HOPWA intake, and those were the specific activities, right? So once they got that life skill down, they'd be disenrolled from that.
You could do it that way, but you don't have to do it that way, right?
So since support services were paid for that, if we did like a program, I worked for CPS before, we implemented like band services and life skills in their house.
Say that again?
Like band services, like a,
Cool.
for CPS, it's like they do like life skills things, so they come in and teach like, not legit have people that don't have much conditions.
Yes.
Or try their.
Yes. You can have a position in your program that is a life skills staff
But I'm
person.
saying like if could we pay for another? like,
Yes,
somebody-
contract out.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could
Potentially.
potentially, yes. Potentially, yes. Yep.
Otherwise, the health services and transportation, and so I skipped nutritional. So also this idea between nutritional, if nutritional can take the form of multiple things, like it could be actual food, it could be food cards or assistance, right? Transportation can be taxi ride, bus passes, single ride, it could be Uber or Lyft. It's pretty open, right, to what that is, because this is also particularly great for rural areas, right? There may not be a bus, right? So being able to say, oh, we can help you with the bus pass is meaningless to someone who doesn't have public transportation. But depending on our budget for rural areas, they can say, I just need a ride to go get my meds because my ride fell through. Great, let's order you a Lyft. It might take 15 minutes for that ride to get there, but at least we know you're going to get your meds and get home safely. So there's a lot of flexibility in that, depending on what's in your contracts and what your specific. Housing information services. I don't think you all are funded for this. Okay, great. There's the reason I include this. So we're going to go over some of the examples of housing information services. But the idea of housing information services is an activity under which you're going to use HOPWA funding to provide information and referral services to help households find housing, whether that's HOPWA or non-housing. That exists outside of all of those activities we just covered. Right? So in some of the jobs you do, right? If you're a case manager, you're going to do that anyway. But this needs to exist outside of all of that, because remember, income eligibility does not apply to housing information services. So this housing HIS can be a really low barrier way to just offer information and referrals. Because then all you basically have to do is just ask about HIV status for someone in the household, and you can start offering referrals. So it sounds like a lot of positions people do, but if you think about it, it can be really different and a great flexible way to be low barrier. Because if it's only offering referrals, right? You're not doing an intake, you're not helping them with their DPRA rent count, right? You're not spending 40 hours a week with it. It's just sort of an information and referral. So some of the things that we've seen programs use housing information for is to conduct in-person and remote classes.
This here will show you how housing information services is a distinct and separately funded activity in the HOPWA program. And like you said, case managers, you do that all the time. It's just part of your day to day. But this takes it up a notch. So you could have staff that 20 hours a week, they're dedicated to this, and their time is charged literally to the housing information services budget line versus your everyday kind of case management. You wouldn't charge it to that. Yeah.
Still need assistance sometimes, and of course, nobody talks about.
Yeah.
System, but I can enroll them.
Right.
And you.
Yeah.
Right, so you.
These are other things you can do with housing information services too.
You've got in-person or remote classes about budgeting, kind of landlord relationships, how to search for affordable housing. A lot of clients don't have that skill, or people don't. I should just say people, right? Because when I was careful on that, every couple of years, everything's changed. How do I find an apartment? Kind of responsibility to other similar activities. I mean, you can do that without documenting family income. Right, so this has been a really great flexible thing for communities that say, we know we have people with HIV, and so we just need to do a couple classes because it would ease our burden on our agency, and we could just offer these classes and not worry about a full intake and asking about the income of a minor and making it adopted. There's some other examples. Another one we see a lot is the almost a pre-screen for persons. And so it's not quite coordinated entry. I hate to use that term for HOPWA, but some programs use this as like a HOPWA version. That someone with HIV can call some sort of line or person, they can ask a couple questions and then they referral, right? Because maybe they're not needed. Maybe HOPWA isn't the resource for them, right? Maybe they're over income. You just asked about income. So before they come into your agency and you start doing intake and realize that they're not eligible or you're not the best fit, that's where programs will use that. And then they can refer them outside of HOPWA or even to particular project sponsors. We've seen that happen. Like a central hub. Resource ID, I know, is new to you all, so we won't spend much time on it today, but we're going to go over this more specifically tomorrow. So housing information services is to serve specific persons or individuals. Resource identification, the systems coordination, that's for working within the system, right? So you're not working for a particular person, you're working for all persons, potentially for a HOPWA eligible. Yeah, good. And so you'll see some of the examples, but generally, if you think about like, you're going to need to coordinate with non-HOPWA resources to better align your programs. The programs will use this to meet with landlords in general, right? To do some landlord outreach for anyone who's potentially HOPWA eligible.
And it's good to it's good to think about resource ID in some buckets. So we've got a few slides. So resource ID, you can think about it as, okay, under resource ID, how can I use it to develop housing resources? And the next slide will say, how can I use resource ID for needs assessment, that kind of thing. So that's how these are laid out.
And to be able to charge that time to HOPWA and not use admin dollars.
Right.
So that's what it's, a lot of programs say, oh, we do this and we just charge it to admin. So this is a separate activity, so you don't need your 7% admin. Right, so we'll see programs use this to meet with other HUD programs to better align, HCD programs, COCs, to say what are your requirements, what are our requirements, how do we better meet referrals, so that once again, HOPWA isn't funding everything for everyone. And also develop new housing resource partnerships, right? You want to start doing master leasing and you're allowed, right? And you can start to use some resource ID to start meeting with landlords, say, let's talk about it, and charge it to HOPWA, instead of having to fundraise that money to cover staff time. If there's anything that people love more than nonprofits, fundraising for every dollar that can't charge the federal award.
Systems coordination.
Right. So we'll see programs use this to try to lead efforts to cross over between housing and health, important for all that we're talking about, to attend meetings of local housing resources. We see programs use this to coordinate housing case management efforts across providers, so to have meetings with HOPWA case management and non-HOPWA case management. Right, so talk about what is it that we fund, what is it that you fund, how do we coordinate that? So we're going to talk about part of that tomorrow too, using resource ID as a way to sort of build those case management relationships, because sometimes people don't need HOPWA or HIV case management, they need the health case management. Right, so if you can work better with that agency that's doing the mental health case management, and you're doing the healthy piece, it's perfect. We haven't mentioned that too, the idea of the needs assessment, right? Sometimes you just need data to figure out what it is that you need to do. You don't even know where to start.
So programs are used for this, particularly we see a lot using HOPWA resource ID to partner with Ryan White, which is their needs assessment. So Ryan White pays for part, HOPWA pays for parts, you ask way more housing related questions for a needs assessment. You get a really good view of what do people with HIV in your area need. You're going to start filtering that through different funding sources. We also see this to conduct client focus groups, right? Or just, I shouldn't even say client, right? Just sort of focus groups for people with HIV. What is it that you need? What is it that you want? How do we better do that? The last activity, HOPWA administration. So, not every federal grant or award has an administrative line. Budget line, a separate activity. So I'd like to stress that because some programs do, like HOPWA. So that means the things that we're going to talk about can only be charged to admin. Because for other federal awards, they'll tell you cram it under everything else. Right, so keep in mind for any federal program that has admin line, like HOPWA or ESG, there's very specific things you can charge there. So HOPWA admin isn't tied to anything we just went over. It's for costs that are required because you have a HOPWA grant or a contract. Things that you are required to do that aren't about specific clients, right? And so the general program management, looking at the budget as a whole, tracking this budget, oversight and monitoring, financial tracking and invoicing, right? So whoever in your agency is filling up the state's invoice, collecting all the backup documentation, paying back and forth, that's not what admin. Any data reporting, that back and forth is all admin. So there are things you're required to do that go here. So we like to remind people that HOPWA admin is like any other federal award or activity we've gone over. So it's a reimbursement line. We'll see programs that think our agency automatically gets 7% of our contract for admin, and they don't need any backup documentation. And then monitoring, they have to return all of that money. So it's not an automatic pot of money that your agency is to spend. You have to prove reimbursement. To stress, HOPWA admin is also not the same as sort of like a financial idea of overhead costs. What we'll sometimes see too, the reason we stress to death this idea of staff time, salary, and overhead is we'll see programs turn all overhead to HOPWA admin. So the office space, paper, pens, and pencils for TBRA staff going to admin because they're accounting their agency here's admin and thinks about their accounting classes. That's not what this is. Doesn't mean there aren't some of those costs being charged to admin, but whoever's doing the paper, they also need an office and paper pen. But you should not be charging all of your overhead costs to admin.
You're gonna run out of admin.
Absolutely.
And you're really not gonna be able to effectively build your budget because you're gonna be charging costs in different places where you don't need to.
Admin's also not for general agency-wide admin, it's not for specific. We stress that because sometimes we'll see programs that say our executive director charges so much time to HOPWA admin, and then monitoring, they'll say, oh, show us where your executive director can prove they did HOPWA admin. Executive director. So they'll come back and say, absolutely not. You don't have proof for reimbursable costs, right? You need to tie that to HOPWA. And then so the caps are there, those are also regulatory. Right, so the grantee is capped at 3% of their allocation from HUD. Project sponsors, you're capped at 7% of your settlement. So in theory, if you charge all of your other costs correctly across HOPWA, that 7% should be more than enough. Right, so it's, sometimes programs will say we just do not have enough admin. We're just burning through cash. And particularly, we sometimes see agencies say, I no longer want to do this. If now we're fundraising $50,000 a year. If they really dig in, it's because they're not allocating costs correctly. So, in conclusion, for our whole brand new first presentation, HOPWA regulatory requirements are only 2. Programs should be careful not to violate duplication of benefits. No one wants to send money back to the state. The state doesn't want to send money back to HUD. No one wants that. And HOPWA funding can be used to support several different housing and non-housing activities to ensure HOPWA eligible households stabilize housing and increase access to care and support. Right, the whole wraparound program. Questions?
And if you think of questions after, that's fine too. We're here for 2 days.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, guys, we'll take a brief pause while we get the next presentation set up.
Okay, guys, we're going to get started with our next session. And then while that's going on, I'm going to be going and getting you a pizza.
Good morning, everyone. I think I've probably seen several of you on calls, but I don't think I've officially met most of you. So if you don't know me, my name is Lindsay Mason. I'm the HIV and viral hepatitis analytical epidemiologist within the Division of STD, HIV, hepatitis, and tuberculosis within the Office of Epidemiology and Prevention Services at the State Health Department. Yeah, it's probably one of my shorter titles I've had, actually, so I don't mind it so much. We'll preface this talk with two things. One, it's not going to take me 55 minutes to do this. And two, I'm still fairly new to the world of HIV surveillance. I come with about 10 years of other infectious disease epi experience, but it's everything other than HIV. So this is all still new to me. So if there are questions that you have that I can't quite answer, I'm happy to take them back to people who have been there longer and get you answers. So don't hesitate to ask, but please forgive me if I can't quite answer it. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is to describe the shift in the epidemiology of HIV that we've seen in West Virginia over recent years. We're going to summarize the descriptive epi. I'll probably also say epi instead of epidemiology a lot. So we're going to summarize the descriptive epi of HIV within West Virginia. Of course, since we've seen this shift, we've taken programmatic action. So we want to tell you about what we've been doing to help address those changes. And as always, we try to review our reporting laws whenever we talk. So in the past, between 1984 and 2011, the average number of new HIV diagnoses annually in West Virginia was 96. From 2014 to 2018, the average number actually decreased a little bit, and that went to 83 diagnoses annually average. Our most common exposure was reported as men who have sex with men, or MSM. Let's keep that in mind to what we've changed to these days. We have had several clusters here in West Virginia. In 2017, there was a cluster in our southern counties, so those blue highlighted counties that you see up there. That was about 47 cases. A little more than half of those reported to be MSM, and only less than 10 reported to be injection drug use in 2017. Ohio County had a cluster identified in 2018, and that consisted of 5 total cases, and that was all 5 reported injection drug use as their risk factor. 5. It doesn't take a whole lot. And hopefully we never get to a point where it does take a lot for HIV to be called a cluster or an outbreak, which if you're not aware of outbreak definitions, it can change based on the condition we're talking about. Anything from 1 case for things like measles to maybe 10 cases for something very common. It depends on the location. So yes, 5 in Ohio County were identified in 2018. They all reported injection drug use. That was before my time here. I'm sort of assuming that they were in a network of people who used drugs together, is my assumption of how that was identified. Cabell County cluster came about in 2018. We're going to talk about that just a tiny bit more on the next slide. And then shortly after that, Kanawha County identified a cluster as well. So in 2017, like I just mentioned, the southern counties identified a multi-county area with increases in HIV diagnoses among gay and bisexual men. This occurred in an area where injection drug use was common. And we were, of course, concerned about the possibility of spread into the communities of people who do inject drugs. We relocated HIV testing sites, increased awareness of HIV testing, and established syringe service programs where they weren't already established. In 2018, when the smaller cluster in Ohio County happened, this was within the injection drug use population in prostitution. And they did the same thing. They expanded testing, promoted needle exchange, and notified partners and raised awareness. Currently, we have 2 clusters or outbreaks open at this point that we are responding to. The first one is Cabell County. That's been ongoing since 2018. Injection drug use is the primary risk factor. A lot of these come through their harm reduction program, and they have really good data on them. So we're able to know the risk factors really well with Cabell County. 100% of the cases in 2020 reported injection drug use as their primary risk factor. 2021, 94% of those cases reported IDU. I will tell you, I just ran this data this morning, and as of yesterday, so our data is the day behind, there are 225 cases for Cabell County. Remember the average annual diagnoses we talked about before were 225 in just Cabell County since 2018. About 30% of cases were diagnosed by the harm reduction program, about 25% in a hospital setting. The increase in cases in 2022, we've been seeing whenever the local health department was able to reinstate their harm reduction program after COVID kind of subsided. Once they got that up and going again, they immediately increased their testing and started being really, really proactive about it. And they identified, of course, a lot of new diagnoses. For Kanawha County, that's been ongoing since 2019. Again, injection drug use is our primary risk factor that we're seeing. Kanawha County cases are a little different. They're very hard to get in touch with. You don't come to care as much. They're just more difficult. So we don't have as great of risk factor data for Kanawha County. But 91% of the cases in 2020 reported IDU as their primary risk factor and 75% in 2021. As of 12/1, I haven't ran this data today, we had 121 cases in this cluster. 44% of those were diagnosed in a hospital setting, 21% by Ryan White Clinic outreach testing, and we are seeing about over 50% homeless or unstably housed in the Kanawha County cluster. So where we're at now with HIV in West Virginia, as we've mentioned multiple times, you've probably gotten to the point of it. Injection drug use has definitely become the primary risk factor responsible for the steady increases that we're seeing in cases in West Virginia. Transmission and new HIV cases for 2020 in West Virginia, 72.1% of cases reported IDU, and 10.3% of cases reported MSM. HIV incidence has increased 74.4% between 2017 and 2020. So also, if you're not familiar with incidence, that's telling us the number of new cases, new diagnoses, not what was already there. Outbreaks of HIV have been reported in these two counties since 2017. And as we talked about, they're both attributed to IDU transmission. At the end of 2020, there were 2,207 people living with HIV or AIDS reported in West Virginia.
What is that number in the class from 2007? So that's, what is that? People in care or what? Or receiving service?
Just people reported to be living with HIV or AIDS. So that doesn't say anything about whether they're in care. Right. Well, they're living in West Virginia.
They were diagnosed here? Does that include people that moved in from out of state?
I think it does. I may have to get some clarification on that, but
So
yeah.
This number should be the number of people who are positive for HIV have reside in West Virginia, whether they moved here from Virginia or out at home,
Right.
where they were tested positive and diagnosed.
So they must be receiving service, otherwise I would.
At some point, they had some kind of lab done or a care visit, something. Yeah.
So the affirmation transfer.
Right.
Is here.
What?
Yeah. And they don't have any money.
Yeah.
Right. So if they have been diagnosed, out of state or tested positive out of state, unless they receive care or services in this state, we would not have it.
Right. We may never know if somebody just comes into the state and never ever receives they never go to a doctor, they don't have anything done, we might not know.
Did you mention children have one of those cases we're talking about?
No. No.
And do you have data on, reported, to the risk factor IDU in other counties? I thought like.
County specific?
Yeah.
So yeah, we do. There's a website and it'll be in one of these slides. It's HIVaware.wv.org, I believe. You can go on there and there's a link that will take you to county specific data. I update that every 2 weeks. It will tell you the total number of cases, and I believe it also says the ones that are related to injection drug use. Data is suppressed, so cases 1 to 4 is going to have an asterisk and you won't see that. But there is data that's updated every 2 weeks.
People, the healthcare and travel are all. People live in all these counties, and there has to be people in other counties who are positive.
Oh, there are. There are, but they're not within a cluster. So we haven't identified the transmission. There can absolutely be somebody who is living with HIV and perhaps they even use injection drugs. They may use clean needles every time. That's not common all the time, but that they may just they could sufficiently contain their illness without transmitting it to anybody else.
So what number constitutes a cluster? Like how many? Because you said Ohio County had a cluster and there were 5.
Just depends on what we see, right? You know, these clusters are going to change the landscape in Cabell and Kanawha County.
I don't project them. Like that paper. I can't believe that they're on a cluster.
Yeah. So in 2017, all those blue Southern states. So that entire thing was a multi-county cluster. So sometimes that happens too, where we've identified the transmission and it's going across jurisdiction lines, so across county lines.
That's how they were still identifying.
Mostly men who have sex with men. Yeah.
How often do you? Because I know
New diagnoses. And that would depend too. You can have one diagnosis that only reports. I do data every 2 weeks. This map isn't going to be updated every 2 weeks, but we do data. Right. Yeah. And you can have it. Right. Epi's fun. It gets tricky. It depends on where people are, what they're reporting, what the risk factors are. You could have 3 new cases. One might only have MSM. One may only be injection drug use. One might just have heterosexual contact. Yeah, all of that goes into consideration. It's not a clear-cut answer. It never is. And it depends. We have some counties where we do something called a time space alert that we run the data through every 2 weeks, and it will look at the average number of diagnoses within this time period for this year, compare it to the past 3 years. And if that number is over a certain number of standard deviations, we look into it much further. And we tease those things out and see, do we have a concern or is this sporadic cases? One county alerts a lot, but they have a correctional facility. So what is happening in that county is people are coming into the correctional facility and being tested. So their numbers as new testing goes way up, but those people weren't in that county. They came from somewhere else where they got it.
Where you show where it says the numbers per county that it says.
Yes.
The increases due to the harm reduction program, that's in 2022. So if y'all know, Long County doesn't have we have one harm reduction program that's super out there. You have to have your
Right.
ID. You have to one for one. So we don't have, and that's why we only had, how many homes? 20.
Well, we have 121 as of the beginning of December.
The 21, but we.
People are hard to get to in Kanawha County.
We just don't have to.
Question?
On that slide, 100 versus 121 cases as of December 1st, in the book, it says 224.
Oh, thanks for pointing that out. That was an error. I got it to Henry in time to fix this, but those were already done. I meant to point that out, but we got sidetracked with questions. I was flipping through it last night reviewing, and I saw that number, and I said, "Ooh, that sounds high," and I had a mini panic. I was like, "Did we suddenly get to 100 new cases? Because this isn't good." I'm not sure what I was looking at when I did that initially.
That one, the correct one.
121 is correct. And that's set to be, that'll be updated next week. I'll do Cabell 1 week, Kanawha, the next one, Cabell, Kanawha. Any other questions on this part before we go on? No, you're good. This is where we were talking. So of course now, like we just talked about, injection drug use is our main risk factor we've been seeing. We've got outbreaks going on in those two counties, and we've at the end of 2020. So I don't have data for right at this moment, but we had that 2,207 people living here with HIV or AIDS. So this will show you the United States and West Virginia. This is incidence of HIV. You can see that yellow line at the top for the United States. Other than about 2014, when it had a small little jump up, it's been pretty steadily decreasing, which is great. West Virginia, you can see we've always kind of been low morbidity, really pretty steady, under about a 5.5. This is per 100,000 population, until 2018, 2019, when these clusters popped up in Kanawha and Cabell, really, and then we spiked. So we are still below the national rate, but not without concern here. We no longer are really considered a low morbidity state. We'd like to get back to that. Oh, I don't have data sorry about that, for the United States for 2020 and 2021. Those were pulled from West Virginia data. So we did go down a tiny bit since 2019. Not a whole lot. We're spiked back up. So what's going on for all of this? I'm sure, all of you are like, this a lot of cases. What are we doing? And we're consistently working to do more and do better and work with you all, work with partners, and to do what we can do. But we've expanded HIV testing to non-traditional settings. So that includes, of course, food distribution sites, homeless shelters. Our prevention people will try to be pretty creative in where they can go, where they can reach people, and how they can get the most people tested and aware of their status. And then, of course, into care. We developed community partner groups to provide HIV testing, develop linkage to care systems. We've increased our disease intervention specialists, or DIS staff, a lot. We now have 14 regional DIS and 3 DIS supervisors, which is great. We're working on increasing surveillance staff to process reports. My position is one of those that came out of that. This is a brand new position, specifically really to look at clusters and outbreaks and be able to respond. And that's the website I mentioned. We're trying to make that more readily available. Of course, with HIV data, there are restrictions and we can't release everything, but we are trying to make it as available as we can. So the last thing I'm going to go over is our reporting laws and recommendations, if you didn't know them. So 64 CSR 7, this is our reportable diseases, events, and conditions law. So this outlines all our reportable conditions in the state. So for HIV and AIDS, it's a category 5 reportable condition, which means basically healthcare providers, facilities, laboratories, they all need to report within 1 week of identifying a case by written report. It also requires the reports to be made on the appropriate report forms that are provided by the Bureau for Public Health. until the disease can be reported electronically into our electronic disease surveillance system, which is our West Virginia Electronic Disease Surveillance System, also known as West Virginia EDS. The other one, the West Virginia Code Chapter 16, Article 3C, is our AIDS-related medical testing and records confidentiality act for routine screening. It says for treatable conditions and part of routine prenatal and perinatal care for persons who engage in high-risk behavior at least annually, do that screening. And if they have no record of any HIV-related testing during pregnancy and the woman presents for labor and delivery. Or you should be doing the routine screening if you have cause to believe the test could provide information important to the care of that patient, or you have cause to believe a significant exposure could have put I think that should say medical, medical or emergency responders or other persons at risk. There is mandated testing where no consent is required. And that is for any person that's charged with prostitution, sexual abuse, sexual assault, incest, sexual molestation, or person who is an injection drug user. 64 CSR 64 is the AIDS-related medical testing and confidentiality. So all healthcare providers who perform or are caused to have to perform serologic or other tests for HIV shall report all infections associated with laboratory tests that are positive or results, including but not limited to all values of CD4 counts and any results from a viral load that are either indicative of or a progression towards the HIV infection to the commissioner, so to the Bureau of Public Health. A confirmed positive report of HIV needs to be submitted within 7 days, like we talked about, of the receipt of those test results, and any laboratories who are conducting HIV testing in West Virginia or providing those results for use within the state need to make a report on the 1st and 15th days of each month of all laboratory tests, including but not limited to all CD4 counts and any results from a viral load that are positive. So they send a report in twice a month that basically tells us how many they got positive over the total number of tests they did. It helps look at percent positivity.
Lindsay, do you know if the county health departments still offer anonymous testing?
They may. So I feel like that probably varies between county to county. It's been a while since I've been at the county health department.
Hospitals, or doctor's offices, OBGYN test, pregnant women with an opt-out. Is that correct?
Unless they're somebody who has high risk behavior. That's what it's saying. So if you have a patient who is pregnant and they've identified they engage in high risk behavior, they should be tested. Or if they didn't have any record, they should. Whether it's opt-out or not, I'm not completely sure. Heather's shaking her head yes, so.
Yeah, I believe it is. Voluntary testing, they're transitioning to.
Yeah, and that's one of the ways they're trying to get more people to know their status. That opt-out is just a way to get more testing done, but people do still have the option to say, I don't want that. Any other questions? Told you this would not take me 55 minutes. Well, my contact information is there. It's in your book. Like I said, that website we update it every 2 weeks. So you can go there, you can look at county level data. I do have to leave early today. So if you think of other questions or anything I might be able to answer for you, don't hesitate to shoot me an email or give me a call, and I'm happy to help. And like I said, if I can't answer it, I will find somebody who can. All right. I don't see Henry with pizza, so I'm assuming we're just going to go for a break until Henry gets back with pizza.
Yeah. Bring it on.